My name is Michelle Voigt. I am a Greenwich resident with a professional background in community-based social services and vocational rehabilitation. For 3 years, I've been supporting survivors of gun violence in Connecticut. I am testifying today in opposition to SB 978. Through my work with survivors and their families, I have become acutely aware of how lives can be destroyed by violent crimes and how the judicial system re-traumatizes victims and survivors through systemic disregard. The ever-changing criminal justice system is devoid of humanity. It neglects their trauma, losses, and most significantly, their life-preserving need for justice. Justice as an absolute, not a forever-changing ideal, pinned on legislative whims and political tides. Forgive me. This evening I had to change my testimony, for this hearing itself is a perfect example of survivor re-traumatization. I have been supporting courageous Jennifer Lawler, mother of Emily Todd, who was murdered in Bridgeport in December of 2018. Today's hearing has rendered her paralyzed, without words, so defeated she could not speak or testify. Understanding how these conversations and proposed legislation affect survivors and victims of violent crime is critical. Oh my God, this is my worst nightmare, having to live like this and dangled around and with pretty much for forever. Like a puppet, the death of my child has yet to kill me, but this system will. These bills that make me feel hopeless, it's inhumane. I'm devastated, beaten down. No one cares about victims, not the people making policy. These policies make me question my ability to live, where my daughter got a death sentence and I have a life sentence. These are the voices I hear, the anguish of victims, survivors, and their families. I'm outraged that victims and survivors have not been equally considered in this legislation. Basic humanity would reason that the most impacted by the crimes are due full consideration. Changing the parole opportunities for individuals up to the age of 25 who are serving lengthy sentences is reckless. According to the U.S. Department of Justice, 21% of violent crimes are committed by individuals aged 18 to 24. As for murder and manslaughter, 33% are committed by individuals aged 18 to 24. These percentages are a significant number of people. They are our neighbors, families, friends, and they are victims and survivors whose lives are forever shattered. Criminal justice reform must include all parties, and the proposed reform must consider the needs of crime victims and survivors. When victims do not have a voice in the criminal justice system, it is injustice. When victims are treated as just a piece of evidence, it is injustice. When the sentence is ever changeable and their life becomes merely to ensure that justice is served, it is injustice. I ask you to spend a minute in Jennifer Lawler's shoes, to consider victims and survivors in all proposed legislation, and to oppose SB 978. I thank you for your time and your consideration.
Thank you, ma'am. Senator Castor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I apologize that I'm in a car, but I wanted to thank Michelle for speaking on behalf of Jen, and Jen for her bravery in coming forth on this legislation, which I know is very painful to her and to other survivors of violent crimes. And I just wanted to ask Michelle if she could recount some of the facts of what Jen has experienced since her daughter was murdered in, I believe it was December 2018. Has there been a trial? Has there been, what is her life like, and how is it impacted by the justice system and maybe lack of resolution?
And there has not been a trial. Clearly, we're in the middle of a pandemic, which has made things impossible. Her every day is controlled by the judicial system, and just hoping that she can have justice for her daughter. So the thought of sentencing and plea deals and pardons are terrifying when someone is merely surviving. And I see this so often with survivors of violent crime, and particularly mothers and fathers who have had their children murdered. Justice is all they live for. And so to have this idea that justice, even after sentencings or even after a plea deal, that the sentence could change based on parole or based on legislation changing, it's terrifying to them to think that they will forever be fighting, and just to discover all of a sudden that there's a bill up and you need to get up and you need to rally and you need to fight to make sure that your voice is heard. It's very hard for people who are already living day to day in extreme trauma.
Thank you. And so, as I understood it, she's not expecting that there will be a trial until 2025, 7 years after her daughter was murdered. And
that's what she's told, yes.
And who knows what the result of the trial will be, but assuming, just for purposes of argument, that there's a conviction, she will then have to, in addition to 7 years of ongoing, an ongoing legal situation, she will then have to revisit that situation every 5 years if the person is up for parole. Is that right?
Correct. And as concerned as she is for herself and her ability to survive that, she also has a son who will survive her and who has survived Emily, who would ultimately, eventually carry this burden.
Thank you. Thanks so much for explaining what it is, what the reality is, and the real impact is, not just on the family, but on the siblings of those who've been violently killed. Thank you so much, Michelle.
Thank you.
And Jen. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Further questions or comments from the committee? If not, I would the only thing I would comment is, obviously, this committee, we try to be open to hearing every voice on every issue. Victims have just as much right to testify here today as anyone that this legislation may help put a previous conviction and a mistake in their prior record beyond them. So I hope folks do understand that certainly this public hearing process, as we sit here on hour number 10 and a half, is open to anyone who wants to testify. And so I do just feel compelled to mention that when you say victims feel they don't have a voice, it is important for folks to recognize that they, again, as I said on the last person testifying, they should feel free to submit written testimony or thoughts to the committee, because people do read it. But obviously there are multiple sides to every issue. So thank you for being with us.